Welcome to the channel, Warfront Global. This channel is built for people who prefer calm analysis over loud headlines, people who want to understand how geopolitics quietly reshapes the global economy. If you find this kind of strategic perspective useful, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are watching right now, leave a comment and tell us something interesting. From which country are you watching this video today? It is always fascinating to see how far this community reaches across the world. Now, let us begin. For 13 days, the most powerful political figure in Israel remained almost completely silent. In a region where statements are usually delivered within hours of military action, this silence immediately attracted global attention. Analysts, journalists, and intelligence observers began asking the same question: why would a leader remain so quiet during the opening phase of a major conflict? To understand this silence, it is necessary to understand the environment in which it happened. The war had already begun reshaping regional stability. Missile exchanges were reported across several borders. Governments across the Middle East placed their military forces on alert, while international observers attempted to determine whether the conflict might expand further. But the consequences were not limited to the battlefield. Financial markets reacted quickly. Energy traders began calculating the risk of disruption to oil supply routes. Shipping companies reviewed their routes through sensitive waterways. Insurance costs for vessels operating near the Persian Gulf started rising as risk assessments changed. In modern conflicts, the economic dimension can be just as important as the military one. This is why the silence of a national leader often attracts as much attention as his speech. When a leader does not speak, markets begin to interpret that silence. Investors attempt to determine whether it signals uncertainty, caution, or deliberate strategic timing. In Netanyahu's case, the silence lasted almost 2 weeks. During that period, military operations continued. Diplomatic channels remained active, and intelligence cooperation between allies appeared to intensify. Yet the Prime Minister himself avoided making a major public statement. For experienced geopolitical observers, this pattern suggested something very deliberate. In war, timing can be as important as action. Leaders often delay public communication until they believe the first phase of events has become clearer. Speaking too early can create expectations that later developments might contradict. Waiting allows them to frame the situation from a position of control. And that is why Netanyahu's sudden appearance after 13 days immediately raised another important question. Was he simply explaining what had already happened, or signaling what might happen next? When Benjamin Netanyahu finally appeared after 13 days of silence, analysts around the world began examining every word he spoke. In modern geopolitics, public statements from national leaders rarely serve only one purpose. A wartime message is usually designed for several audiences at the same time. The first audience is always domestic. Inside Israel, the public had spent nearly 2 weeks living under the pressure of an expanding regional conflict. Missile alerts, military mobilization, and constant news coverage created a climate of uncertainty. In such moments, the role of leadership communication becomes extremely important. Netanyahu's message was carefully structured. He spoke with confidence. He emphasized strength. He repeated phrases suggesting that Israel was in control of the situation. This style of messaging serves a psychological function. In wartime, governments try to maintain public confidence even when the situation is complex. Citizens need to believe that their leadership understands the direction of the conflict. Without that confidence, public support can weaken. But the domestic audience was only one part of the calculation. The second audience was international allies. Israel's strategic partnership with the United States and several Western governments plays a critical role in its military capabilities. Diplomatic support, intelligence sharing, and defense systems all depend on those relationships. When Netanyahu spoke publicly, he was also communicating with those governments. His tone signaled that Israel remained committed to the campaign and that its leadership believed the strategy was working. This type of signal is important in alliance politics. Allies constantly evaluate the stability and determination of their partners. If a government appears uncertain, foreign support can weaken. If it appears confident and organized, cooperation tends to continue. However, there was also a third audience listening carefully. That audience was the global business community. For investors, multinational corporations, and energy traders, geopolitical speeches often act as indicators of risk. They analyze these statements not only for political meaning, but also for economic signals. Netanyahu's message suggested that the conflict was under strategic control and that Israel believed it was moving toward a favorable outcome. But markets often ask a different question. They ask whether the underlying conditions support that optimism. At the time of the speech, energy markets remained volatile. Oil prices had already reacted to the possibility of disruption in the region. Shipping insurers were adjusting risk calculations for vessels operating near sensitive maritime corridors. From a purely economic perspective, stability had not yet returned. This gap between political messaging and market behavior is common during wartime. Leaders communicate confidence because confidence stabilizes public morale. Markets, on the other hand, operate on probability and risk assessment. Investors are less interested in speeches and more interested in supply routes, military capabilities, and diplomatic negotiations. Another important element of Netanyahu's speech was timing. He chose to speak after 13 days, not after 3 or 4. This delay allowed Israeli military operations to unfold during the opening stage of the conflict. By the time he addressed the public, certain tactical developments had already taken place. This allowed him to frame the situation from a position of apparent control. Strategic communication often works this way. Leaders wait until the early phase of uncertainty passes before presenting their narrative to the world. For experienced observers, the real significance of the speech was not simply the message itself, it was the broader strategic environment surrounding it. Behind the confident tone of the press conference were deeper geopolitical dynamics that would shape the future of the conflict. Energy markets remained fragile. Regional alliances were being tested. Military supply systems were under pressure. These factors suggested that the war was not only a military contest, it was also becoming a test of economic endurance. And when wars evolve into economic contests, the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. Understanding those deeper calculations requires looking beyond the speech itself and examining the global systems now affected by the conflict. That is where the real strategic story begins. Far from the speeches, the press conferences, and the political statements, the real center of this conflict lies in a narrow stretch of water that most people in the world have never seen. It is called the Strait of Hormuz. At first glance, it does not look extraordinary. On a map, it appears as a thin corridor between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. But in reality, this narrow passage is one of the most important economic gateways on Earth. Nearly 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil traded globally moves through this strait. Every day, massive oil tankers leave the ports of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar, passing through this corridor before entering international markets. For decades, the stability of this waterway has been taken for granted, but wars change assumptions. And when conflicts unfold in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz becomes the first place analysts look. Because controlling this passage does not require dominating the entire region. It only requires the ability to make the route dangerous. Even the possibility of disruption can send shockwaves through global markets. Oil traders react instantly to risk. Insurance companies raise premiums for tankers. Shipping companies reconsider routes. And governments begin calculating how long their strategic reserves can last. The economic chain reaction moves quickly. When energy prices rise, transportation becomes more expensive. When transportation becomes more expensive, manufacturing costs increase. And when manufacturing costs increase, those costs eventually reach consumers. This is why the Strait of Hormuz has often been described as the economic pressure point of the global system. Iran understands this reality very well. While the country cannot compete with the combined military power of Western alliances in a conventional sense, it possesses geographic leverage that few nations in the world can match. The coastline of Iran stretches along much of the northern side of the strait. From this position, even limited naval activity can influence the perception of safety for ships passing through the corridor. And perception matters, because in global markets, fear can move prices just as quickly as actual disruption. This is why even small incidents in the region, a damaged tanker, a drone sighting, or naval maneuvering, can cause immediate reactions in energy markets. For business leaders, this is not simply a geopolitical story, it is an economic one. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable for an extended period, the effects would travel through nearly every sector of the global economy. Energy costs would rise, transportation would become more expensive, and industries that depend on stable fuel prices would face new uncertainty. In that sense, the war unfolding in the Middle East is not confined to the region itself. It sits directly on top of one of the most sensitive economic arteries in the world. And that reality means the decisions made by political leaders today will not only shape the battlefield, they will also shape the future direction of global markets. Wars rarely end when the missiles stop. The military phase may dominate headlines, but the economic consequences often last far longer. In fact, for many countries and businesses, the true impact of war begins only after the fighting stabilizes. The conflict that brought Netanyahu back into public view after 13 days is already beginning to reshape global economic expectations. The first area of concern is energy. Modern economies depend heavily on reliable access to oil and natural gas. When conflict threatens key energy corridors, even temporarily, markets react quickly. Traders begin pricing in the possibility of shortages, and governments start evaluating emergency reserves. Energy disruptions rarely remain limited to one country. When supply becomes uncertain in a major producing region, prices can rise globally. Higher energy prices then influence nearly every sector of the economy. Transportation costs increase for airlines, shipping companies, and logistics providers. Manufacturing becomes more expensive as factories consume more costly fuel and electricity. Agricultural producers face rising operating costs because fertilizers, irrigation systems, and farm equipment rely heavily on energy. This chain reaction is one reason economic analysts watch geopolitical developments so closely. But energy is only one layer of the economic impact. Another critical factor is investor confidence. Financial markets are highly sensitive to uncertainty. When geopolitical tensions rise, investors often move capital into assets they consider safer. These shifts can influence currency values, stock markets, and commodity prices. Businesses planning long-term investments must then reconsider their strategies. A company deciding whether to build a factory, expand operations, or enter a new market must consider political stability as part of its calculations. When uncertainty grows, executives sometimes delay decisions until the situation becomes clearer. This hesitation can slow economic activity across multiple industries. The third major consequence involves global supply chains. Over the past several decades, companies have built complex networks of production and transportation that connect factories, ports, and consumers around the world. These systems depend on predictable trade routes and stable geopolitical relationships. When a conflict threatens a key maritime corridor or regional hub, those supply chains can experience disruption. Businesses may be forced to reroute shipments, locate alternative suppliers, or maintain larger inventories to protect against delays. Each of these adjustments increases operating costs. For entrepreneurs and business leaders, the lesson is becoming increasingly clear. Geopolitical awareness is no longer optional. A generation ago, many companies could operate successfully while paying limited attention to international politics. Today, that approach is far more difficult. Events in one region can quickly affect markets on the other side of the world. This is why strategic observers pay attention not only to battles, but also to signals. When Netanyahu finally spoke after 13 days, he was doing more than addressing the immediate military situation. His appearance represented a moment within a much larger geopolitical process, one that will influence markets, alliances, and economic planning for years to come. The speech itself may fade from headlines in the coming days, but the forces shaping the conflict will continue to operate beneath the surface. Energy security, trade routes, financial stability. These systems connect nations and businesses across the globe. And as long as uncertainty remains in one of the world's most strategically important regions, decision makers everywhere will continue watching carefully. Because in the modern world, war is rarely only about territory. It is also about economics, power, and the future direction of the global system.